The auction hall at Summit Ridge Classics smelled of lemon polish and old leather. 200 bidders packed the risers. Vanessa Hargrove, CEO in a charcoal Armani suit and blood-red Louboutin heels, stood over the dust-covered 1958 Lincoln Sentinel prototype like it had personally offended her. She flicked a speck of barn mold from the crimson fender, then looked straight at the man in the oil-stained Carhartt jacket. Scrap iron at best. Worthless. Take your tools and leave. The words landed like a dropped wrench. Laughter rippled through the room. Head appraiser Nolan Pierce smirked from the podium, gold Rolex catching the lights. She had no idea the single-father mechanic she had just humiliated in front of every bidder was the only man alive who had secretly built its hidden safeguard systems 12 years earlier. What exact sequence had he locked inside that engine that 3 expert teams had missed for months? Comment below which country you're watching from. Let's find out. Elias Crowe stood motionless for 3 full seconds, the echo of her voice still bouncing off the rafters. His toolbox rested at his feet, scarred steel, handle wrapped in frayed electrical tape. Tucked inside the lid, folded into a tight square, was a child's crayon drawing of a rocket car. Clara had given it to him the morning his reputation first burned. He never left the garage without it. This was supposed to be a simple job. Summit Ridge had called him at 6:50 a.m. to fix a loading dock forklift that kept shearing pins. He drove 90 minutes from the rural garage outside Knoxville where he worked nights on 18-wheelers, raising 8-year-old Clara alone since her mother's accident 4 years ago. He arrived at 7:14 a.m., coveralls already smelling of diesel and strong coffee. That was when he heard it. Across the service bay, the Sentinel's starter motor coughed in a jagged, offbeat rhythm. 3 restoration crews had spent $375,000 and still couldn't get it to idle clean. The car had been dragged from a flood-damaged barn outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Black over crimson paint. No matching factory records. Every expert who touched it walked away swearing it was either a hoax or a very expensive mistake. Vanessa Hargrove needed this car to sell. Summit Ridge Classics was $31 million in debt after 2 collapsed European deals. If the prototype didn't bring serious money in the next 5 weeks, the entire inventory would be forced into the hands of rival investor Damon Roth. Elias stepped forward before he could stop himself. "Ma'am, the misfire is in the vacuum routing. I can show you in under 10 minutes. Vanessa turned slowly. Her gold Rolex flashed as she crossed her arms. She studied his grease-blackened fingernails, the faded Knoxville Speedway patch on his chest, the cheap steel-toe boots. "And you are?" "Elias Crowe. Forklift mechanic on contract." Nolan Pierce laughed from the stage. "Credentials, Crowe? Or did you just wander in off the highway?" Elias kept his voice even. "I don't need credentials to hear what that engine is trying to tell me." Vanessa checked her watch. "Security is due on the floor in 9 minutes. Impress me before then or leave." The room settled into expectant silence. Elias walked to the Sentinel. He didn't open the hood first. Instead he dropped to one knee, ran his fingertips under the glove box lid, and found what he was looking for. A tiny meridian star, hand-etched with a jeweler's scribe. His own mark. From the Meridian Vault in Nevada, 12 years ago, when this car was never meant to see daylight. He borrowed a flathead screwdriver from a nearby Tex rollaway and an 18-gauge wire from his own toolbox. 8 minutes and 47 seconds later the big V8 caught with a deep, guttural growl that vibrated the concrete floor. A sound no production Sentinel had ever made. Heads turned. Conversations died. Nolan's smile faltered. "That's staged. He's running a remote." "Quiet," Vanessa said, voice suddenly sharp. The engine settled into a velvet idle, perfectly even. Elias shut it down with the same borrowed screwdriver. He stood, wiped his hands on a red shop rag, and met Vanessa's eyes. Day 1. 72 hours on the clock. Vanessa studied him for a long moment, Louboutins clicking once as she stepped closer. The scent of her perfume, something expensive and cold, cut through the smell of hot oil. 72 hours, Mr. Crowe. Consultant rate. Prove this car is more than scrap and I'll pay triple. Fail, and you go back to your little garage in Tennessee with nothing but the memory of today. Elias gave a single nod. Inside his chest, something long buried clicked into place. They moved the Sentinel into the locked basement archive wing. Quiet archivist Sophia Reyes joined them at 9:20 p.m. By 11:47 p.m. they had found the first reversed serial numbers stamped on the inner fender. At 1:55 a.m. they discovered the swapped control modules hidden behind the custom firewall. At 2:14 a.m. Elias removed the rear seat bolster. The hidden compartment he himself had engineered 12 years earlier was still sealed. He used the tip of a pocket knife to pry the panel. Inside rested the original confirmation papers, pages he had signed under the codename Milton, and a brass key etched with the same meridian star he had once stamped himself. The key felt warm in his palm. He closed his fingers around it and thought of Clara sleeping back home, her newest rocket car drawing waiting on the fridge. But the night wasn't over. At 3:37 a.m. the fuel rail pressure suddenly collapsed. Someone had loosened the fittings. 23 minutes of security footage from the archive wing had been wiped. Nolan Pierce claimed he was in a budget meeting across town. Vanessa believed him. For now. The only legal way to avoid Damon Roth's secret $110,000 right of first refusal clause was a public functionality test scheduled in 19 hours. The car would have to idle cleanly for 9 full minutes, complete a measured oval at operating temperature, and shut down without a single leak. 19 hours. Elias Crowe stood alone beside the silent prototype, the brass key turning slowly between his fingers. The folded crayon rocket car waited inside his toolbox like a promise. Day one was almost gone. And the engine still had secrets it refused to give up without a fight. The brass key turned once between his fingers, cool metal warming against his skin like it remembered him. Elias tucked it into the chest pocket of his grease-stained coveralls. The folded crayon rocket car stayed inside the toolbox, its edges soft from 1,000 touches. Day 2. 6:12 a.m. Vanessa stormed into the archive wing carrying 2 coffees and a tablet. Her heels clicked sharp against the concrete. The test track just called. They moved the oval up. We run at 4 this afternoon. 14 hours, Mr. Crowe. Not 19. She set one coffee down hard enough that hot liquid sloshed over the rim. The smell of burnt chicory mixed with the faint tang of leaking hydraulic fluid still hanging in the air. Elias didn't flinch. He had already replaced the loosened fittings at dawn, torquing each one to 62 foot-pounds with the same torque wrench he kept in the truck. But the pressure collapse had exposed something worse. A hairline crack in the custom manifold he had machined himself in a hangar outside Kabul 12 years earlier. The kind of flaw that would bloom under load and spray fuel across the oval like a flare. He worked in silence while Sophia Reyes hovered nearby, logging every part number. At 7:41 a.m. the archivist's phone buzzed. She read the screen, frowned, then handed it to Vanessa. Internal memo. Damon Roth just doubled his right of first refusal to $220,000. Cash wired this morning. He says the Sentinel belongs in a private collection. Not on any public track. Vanessa's polished nails drummed once against the tablet. Her Brioni jacket was still crisp despite the hour. He can't do that if the car passes functional certification. That's the clause. So fix it, Mr. Crowe. Or I'll have security escort you back to Tennessee before lunch. Elias lifted the cracked manifold under the work light. The fracture caught the glow exactly where his old welding signature should have been. He ran a thumb across the imperfection. The brass key in his pocket suddenly felt heavier. By 9:03 a.m. he had the manifold on a bench vise. Sophia watched him weld the repair with 12-year-old muscle memory. The arc popped softly, blue-white against the dim basement. At 10:27 a.m. he pressure tested the seal at 180 psi. It held. The relief in his shoulders was small, private. A quiet reversal. But at 11:14 a.m. the new crisis landed. Security footage from the parking deck surfaced on Vanessa's tablet. Timestamp 3:12 a.m. A figure in a dark hoodie leaned over the Sentinel's fuel rail, loosening the fittings with a half-inch wrench. The hood slipped back for 2 full seconds. Clear enough for facial recognition. It wasn't Nolan Pierce. It was the night shift archivist's cousin, a 23-year-old kid named Miguel who worked part-time in the restoration shop. And Miguel had just been found unconscious in his apartment with a fractured wrist and a note pinned to his jacket that read, "Stay out of the basement." Sophia's hands shook when she saw the photo. "He's my family. He doesn't even know what the car is." Her voice cracked on the last word. Vanessa's face tightened. For the first time her perfect posture slipped half an inch. She looked at Elias as if weighing whether to trust the janitor from Tennessee or burn the whole project before Roth could claim it. Elias said nothing. He simply wiped his hands on a blue shop rag, the same color as the one he once used to clean carbon off turbine blades at 30,000 feet. Then he walked to the far corner of the archive and pulled a dusty tarp off a metal cabinet no one had opened in a decade. Inside sat a locked Pelican case. The latches clicked open under the brass key. Nested foam cradled a spare manifold identical to the one now repaired. Serial number MS4471. The exact unit he had machined as a contingency in 2012 under the Milton authorization. He had shipped 3. Only 2 had ever been installed. This was the 3rd. Vanessa stared at the case like it had grown teeth. "Where did that come from?" Elias kept his voice low. "Same place the reversed serials came from. You wanted proof the car was more than scrap. Here's your proof. But the kid upstairs is bleeding because someone doesn't want that proof on the track this afternoon." The folded crayon rocket sat on the edge of the toolbox, its bright red nose pointing toward the open case. A small, silent reminder. 12 hours to the test. At 1:50 p.m. they loaded the Sentinel onto a flatbed for transport to the private oval 10 miles outside the city. The sky had turned the color of old steel. Rain began to fall in thin, cold needles. Day 2. 2:22 p.m. The flatbed never made it to the track. 3 miles from the archive, the truck's rear brake line ruptured on a rain-slick curve. The driver fought the wheel, tires screaming against wet asphalt. The Sentinel shifted hard in its restraints, metal groaning. When the truck finally shuddered to a stop on the shoulder of Highway 41, the prototype sat at a dangerous angle, one wheel hanging over the guardrail. Elias climbed out of the cab first. The smell of burnt brake fluid stung his nostrils. He circled the rig once, boots splashing through puddles. The new manifold was still intact. The crayon drawing, however, had slipped from the toolbox during the slide and now lay half-soaked against the curb. He picked it up carefully, unfolding the damp paper between calloused fingers. Clara's childish rockets still streaked across the page, but the ink had run, turning the flames into long violet trails. The sight tightened something behind his ribs. Vanessa arrived 20 minutes later in a Blacktown car, Nolan Pierce riding shotgun. Her Italian shoes were ruined the moment she stepped onto the muddy shoulder. She looked at the dangling wheel, then at Elias holding the ruined drawing. For the first time her voice carried something close to doubt. "Roth's people. It has to be." The brake line was cut clean. Nolan adjusted his Patek Philippe, the watch face catching the gray light. "We can postpone the test. 48 more hours. Regroup." Elias folded the damp crayon rocket into a careful square and slid it back into his coverall pocket, right beside the brass key. The paper felt heavier now, important. No postponement, he said. His tone was quiet steel. We tow it the rest of the way. We run the test tonight. In the rain if we have to. He looked straight at Vanessa when he spoke the next line. And when it passes, you're going to tell me exactly why Damon Roth is willing to hurt people to keep this car off the oval. Day 2. 4:17 p.m. They reached the test facility under police escort. The oval sat under floodlights, wet pavement gleaming like black glass. Technicians swarmed the Sentinel, resecuring tie-downs, drying sensors with compressed air. The smell of ozone and wet rubber filled the covered pit lane. Sophia had stayed behind at the archive to watch over Miguel in the hospital, but she texted every 30 minutes. Each update carried the same core stakes. The functionality test was now the only legal shield between the prototype and Roth's doubled offer. Fail, and the car vanished into a private vault by sunrise. Pass, and the original ownership papers hidden inside the rear bolster would trigger an automatic title transfer Elias had buried in the corporate charter 12 years earlier. At 5:55 p.m. the rain eased into a cold mist. The track steward gave the signal. Elias climbed into the prototype's driver's seat for the first time since the night he had driven it off a C-17 ramp over the Hindu Kush. The leather still smelled faintly of jet fuel and desert sand. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first crank, a low predatory rumble that vibrated up through the steering wheel and into his bones. The brass key rested on the dash now, meridian star catching the instrument glow. Vanessa stood at the pit wall in a borrowed raincoat, arms folded tight. Nolan paced beside her, shoes spotless despite the puddles. The test required 9 clean idle minutes, followed by 3 measured laps at operating temperature, then a dead shutdown with 0 leaks. The first 4 minutes passed without incident. The manifold held. The reverse serials stayed hidden behind fresh panels. Elias kept his eyes on the gauges, breath steady. At minute 6 the crisis hit again. A low-pressure warning flashed on the auxiliary fuel circuit. Not sabotage this time. Condensation from the rain had wicked into a connector he had overlooked in the pre-dawn repair. The engine began to stumble, the rhythmic growl turning ragged. Elias didn't panic. He eased off the throttle, let the revs fall to 800 revolutions per minute, and reached under the dash with a mechanic's mirror and a strip of electrical tape. 38 seconds of field surgery. The stumble smoothed. The warning light died. He completed the required idle. Then he took the car onto the wet oval. The tires hissed. Spray rooster-tailed behind him in the floodlights. 2 laps clean. On the 3rd lap the rear diffuser began to vibrate at 87 miles per hour, exactly where the original engineering drawings warned it might under sustained load. He lifted slightly, feathered the throttle, and the vibration faded. The car crossed the line at 6:41 p.m. No leaks. The steward's stopwatch clicked. 9 minutes and 14 seconds of flawless operation. The prototype idled down without a cough, then fell silent. Elias sat in the cockpit for a long beat, heart hammering against the brass key now back in his pocket. Through the rain-streaked windshield he saw Vanessa standing motionless at the pit wall. Her face had gone pale under the lights. Nolan was already on his phone, speaking low and fast. Day 2. 7:03 p.m. Back in the archive wing the mood had shifted. Sophia waited with fresh coffee and a tablet showing the official certification stamp. The folded crayon rocket lay open on the workbench, drying under a heat lamp. Its violet flame trails looked almost purposeful now, like contrails across a night sky. Vanessa arrived at 8:22 p.m. She had changed into a fresh Brioni suit. The Italian shoes were gone, replaced by softer leather flats that still carried traces of track mud. She stopped 3 feet from Elias. "I watched the telemetry," she said. Her voice had lost its earlier blade. "No one else on my staff could have caught that condensation fault in 38 seconds. No one." She reached into her jacket and produced a single sheet of paper. An addendum to the original Milton contract, dated 11 years ago, bearing a signature she had never seen before. Elias Crowe. Not as a mechanic. As the lead stealth integration engineer who had designed the Sentinel's entire powertrain under a black-budget program that officially never existed. The paper trembled slightly in her hand. "I thought you were just a consultant from Tennessee," she whispered. "I had no idea I was standing in front of the man who built this car from nothing." Elias looked at the brass key resting beside the crayon drawing. The Meridian star caught the overhead light exactly as it had the night he stamped the final prototype in a hangar in Nevada. He met Vanessa's eyes. "You still don't," he said quietly. "Not everything. Not yet." Outside, the rain began again, drumming against the high windows. Somewhere in the city, Damon Roth was already rewriting his next move. Day 3 had begun. And the Sentinel still carried one final secret locked behind the swapped control modules, something that would force even Roth to watch his polished empire begin to crack. But that revelation would have to wait. Because at 2:14 a.m. the archive alarms began to scream, and the brass key grew warm in Elias's palm once more. Day 3. 2:14 a.m. The archive wing erupted in a shriek of alarms. Red strobes painted the steel shelves like emergency flares across a runway. Elias moved without thinking, brass key already clenched in his fist. The metal had gone hot again, the same fever heat it carried the night the original prototype rolled out of the Nevada hangar under a black tarp. He reached the main vault door in 4 strides. The keypad blinked wrong, someone had fed it a ghost code. The lock clicked open anyway. Inside, a shadow froze over the Sentinel's exposed drivetrain. Gloved hands held a small black device the size of a cigarette pack. A signal jammer, military grade. Elias didn't shout. He simply said, "You're 4 seconds too late." The intruder spun. Ski mask. Tactical vest. The kind of gear that cost more than most mechanics made in a year. He lunged for the exit. Elias caught him with one arm, slammed him against the carbon fiber fender. The impact rang through the empty wing like a hammer on an anvil. The jammer clattered across the concrete. Security arrived 30 seconds later, boots pounding. Vanessa appeared right behind them, hair still damp from a rushed shower, Brioni jacket thrown over silk pajamas. Her eyes found the brass key first, then the man on the floor. "Call the police," she ordered, voice steady but low. "And get my head of security out of bed. Now." The intruder said nothing as cuffs clicked. But when the mask came off in the holding room upstairs, the face beneath it belonged to a mid-level Roth Dynamics engineer named Marcus Hale. Damon Roth's own nephew. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Day 3. 4:47 a.m. They sat in the small observation lounge overlooking the archive. Sophia had brewed a fresh pot strong enough to strip paint. The folded crayon rocket rested between them on the glass table, its violet trails now dry and vivid under the single desk lamp. Elias turned the brass key over and over in his fingers. The Meridian star glinted each time it caught the light. Vanessa stared at the security footage on her tablet. He was trying to plant a firmware worm. It would have overwritten the Sentinel's final drive mapping at the exact moment the auction clock hit 0. The car would have failed its live diagnostic on stage. In front of 200 investors. In front of the press. She set the tablet down. Her hands were no longer trembling. They were simply still. "I've already terminated every Roth contractor on my property," she said. "But my board is starting to ask questions. They want to know why a simple charity auction for a prototype hypercar has turned into this." Elias took a slow sip of coffee. It tasted like engine grease and old memories. Because the Sentinel was never meant to be sold. It was built as a proof of concept for something bigger. Something that could run dark for weeks without satellite pings. Damon Roth sat in on 3 of those black budget reviews. He knows exactly what this car can still do. Vanessa studied him the way a pilot studies unfamiliar instruments. And you designed it. I flew the first 72 missions in the predecessor, Elias said quietly. The words slipped out like a loose panel finally giving way. Call sign Meridian. That's why the star is on the key. My daughter drew it on every schematic I brought home. She was 6. She thought her dad flew rockets. The crayon drawing seemed to glow warmer under the lamp. Vanessa leaned back. For the first time, the Brioni suit looked like armor that no longer quite fit. My father bought this company because he believed in second chances. I fired you because I believed the paperwork. I was wrong on both counts. I'm sorry, Elias. Privately. For now. He nodded once. The apology landed like a precise instrument landing, soft, controlled, exactly on the numbers. Day 4. 11:20 a.m. The boardroom on the 23rd floor smelled of lemon polish and fear. 12 directors in Italian will watched Vanessa present the updated auction terms. The crayon rocket lay centered on the mahogany table like a child's flag planted on foreign soil. Elias stood at the back in the same oil-stained coveralls, arms folded. No one had offered him a seat. No one dared ask him to leave. Roth's legal team had filed an emergency injunction overnight claiming the Sentinel still belonged to them under an old joint development clause. The courtroom hearing was set for tomorrow at 9 a.m. 43 hours until the auction gavel fell. During the break, one of the younger directors, a man with a Patek Philippe that cost more than Elias's truck, cornered Vanessa near the espresso machine. This is turning into a circus, he hissed. First the break-in, now Roth is threatening to pull every parts contract we have. Our stock is already down 4%. Fire the janitor, Vanessa. Before he burns the whole place down. She looked past the man's shoulder to where Elias stood motionless by the window. The brass key hung from a lanyard around his neck now, resting against the faded logo on his chest. The Meridian star caught the morning light exactly as it had when his daughter clipped it to his flight suit the morning of mission 287. He stays, Vanessa said. Her voice carried across the sudden silence. And if anyone else has a problem with that, they can tender their resignation before lunch. The director's polished shoes squeaked once as he stepped back. Day 4. 3:15 p.m. A new mini-crisis arrived in the form of a single encrypted email. Sophia forwarded it to both of them with the subject line, "Final Warning." The message contained a photograph taken from across the street at 2:14 a.m., the exact minute the archive alarms had screamed. It showed Elias dragging the intruder away from the Sentinel, brass key clearly visible in his raised hand. Beneath the image, 6 words in stark white text. We know who you really are, Meridian. Roth had found the old flight logs. He was no longer guessing. Elias stared at the screen until the pixels burned. Then he did the only thing that still made sense. He walked back down to the archive wing, rolled up his sleeves, and began removing the swapped control modules one careful connector at a time. Each click sounded like a round chambered in a quiet hangar. Vanessa found him there at dusk. She carried 2 things, a fresh cup of coffee and the crayon rocket, now sealed inside a thin acrylic case to protect the fragile paper. I canceled the rest of my meetings, she said. The softer leather flats were back. Track mud still clung to the edges. Tell me what comes next. No more half-truths. Elias wiped his hands on a shop rag. The brass key swung gently against his sternum, warm again. Day 5 starts with the courtroom, he answered. Roth will try to paint me as a disgraced contractor who stole classified drawings. But there's one telemetry log he doesn't have. One flight that never made it into any official database. If I release it, the Sentinel stops being a car and becomes evidence in a federal investigation. His evidence. He looked at the acrylic case. The violet contrails inside seemed to streak forward, pulling the eye toward an unseen horizon. Vanessa exhaled slowly. And if we lose in court tomorrow? Elias placed the brass key on the workbench beside the sealed drawing. The meridian star aligned perfectly with the rocket's nose. Then we'll still have 41 hours until the auction. And the car still carries one final secret behind those modules. Something Roth helped bury 11 years ago. Something that will make even his Brioni suit look cheap when the whole room sees it. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, one by one, like distant afterburners. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the metallic taste of ozone and old secrets. Day 5. 8:07 a.m. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters when the black SUV pulled up. Elias stepped out first. The brass key was hidden beneath his shirt now, but its heat pressed against his skin like a second heartbeat. Vanessa followed in full armor, charcoal Brioni, crisp white cuffs, the same softer flats that still carried last night's track mud. Inside, courtroom 17C smelled of old wood and fresh panic. Damon Roth sat at the plaintiff's table in a three-piece suit the color of midnight. His Patek caught the overhead lights every time he moved his wrist. He did not look at Elias. Not yet. The judge called the session to order at 9:02 a.m. Roth's attorney began the opening argument with a voice like oiled steel. Your Honor, the defendant's own signature appears on documents that prove he was terminated for cause 11 years ago. He has no standing to interfere with the sale of company property. This so-called mechanic is nothing more than a disgruntled former employee attempting to sabotage a legitimate auction. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Cameras clicked. Vanessa's hand tightened on the acrylic case in her lap. Inside, the crayon rocket waited, violet trails frozen mid-flight. Elias sat perfectly still. He could feel the countdown ticking behind his eyes. 19 hours to the auction. And the next mini-crisis was already walking through the side door in the form of a surprise witness. Roth had just added to the docket an elderly night shift security guard from the Nevada hangar who claimed he remembered exactly what happened the night Meridian flew his last classified mission. The old man shuffled to the stand. His eyes found Elias across the room and widened with genuine shock. The brass key grew warmer still against Elias's chest. The grind had just become public. The old man's voice cracked like dry leather when he swore in. I remember that night clear as runway lights. November 14, 2013. Hangar 7B. The kid they called the ghost mechanic was the only soul authorized to touch Meridian's auxiliary fuel cells. Signed the log at 2:14 a.m. with his own hand. A ripple of whispers swept the gallery. Roth's attorney leaned forward, smiling the thin smile of a man who believed he had already won. And that same mechanic was fired 3 weeks later for gross insubordination, correct? The guard hesitated. His gaze kept drifting back to Elias, as if trying to reconcile the quiet man in the worn denim jacket with the ghost he once knew. Elias felt the brass key burn against his sternum. He did not move. Vanessa slid a single sheet of paper across the defense table. Elias's printed name was at the bottom, but the signature above it had been forged. The ink was wrong. The pressure marks were wrong. He had spotted it the night before in the glow of a single desk lamp while the city slept. Day 5. 11:47 a.m. The judge called a 15-minute recess. Reporters surged toward the hallway like hungry gulls. Outside courtroom 17C, the air tasted of burnt coffee and damp wool. Elias stayed seated. The crayon rocket inside its acrylic case caught the weak sunlight and threw violet shards across the table. Roth finally looked at him. Not with anger. With something closer to unease. You really think you can stop this? Roth asked under his breath, adjusting the Patek on his wrist. The watch face read 11:51. That plane is scrap. It belongs in a museum or a junkyard. Not in your hands. Elias met his eyes for the first time since the hearing began. It never belonged to the museum, Mr. Roth. And it sure as hell doesn't belong to whoever's paying you $8 million to bury it. Roth's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The private apology was still months away. Today he only saw a janitor with delusions. Vanessa touched Elias's sleeve. They're bringing up the classified flight logs next. We need something. He gave the faintest nod. The key pulsed again. Not metaphor. Not imagination. The metal itself had begun reacting to proximity, the way it always had when Meridian was close enough to feel. Day 5. 3:19 p.m. The elderly guard was back on the stand, this time under cross-examination. Vanessa's questions were surgical. Each answer chipped another fragment from Roth's narrative. The guard admitted he had seen the real Elias that night, not the man whose forged signature appeared on the termination papers. He remembered the smell of hydraulic fluid on Elias's sleeves, the precise way he had recalibrated the bird's inertial navigation without a manual. Roth's face remained calm, but his left hand betrayed him. The fingers drummed once against the plaintiff's table, a nervous Morse code no one else caught. Then the surprise landed. Roth's attorney introduced a new exhibit, Exhibit 47, a grainy security still from the hangar camera dated 3:22 a.m. on that same November night. The image showed a figure in dark coveralls leaning into Meridian's open engine bay. The face was obscured. The caption beneath it read "Unauthorized personnel." The attorney turned to the jury box that had been impaneled only that morning. This man was never cleared for that aircraft. The defendant's own team let an outsider sabotage a classified asset. That is why he was removed. That is why the plane must be sold and destroyed before its secrets leak further. The courtroom lights buzzed overhead. The smell of ozone crept in again, as if the rain outside had followed them indoors. Elias stared at the photograph. He knew the angle of those shoulders. He knew the way the left boot favored a stress fracture earned over Kandahar. The man in the image was not an outsider. It was him. And the photo had been deliberately mislabeled. Day 5. 4:41 p.m. The judge ordered the image enlarged on the courtroom monitors. Gasps followed. Reporters scribbled furiously. One journalist in the third row actually dropped his phone. The clatter echoed like a starter pistol. Roth looked genuinely startled now. The Patek caught the projector light and flashed like a warning. He had not expected the photo to be introduced this way. His own legal team had overplayed their hand. Vanessa rose slowly. Your Honor, we move to admit Defense Exhibit B. A contemporaneous maintenance log written in the defendant's hand at 3:27 a.m. that same night. It details the exact calibration he performed on Meridian's classified star tracker array. A tracker that, according to publicly available records, saved 17 pilots during Operation Silent Drift 6 weeks later. She placed the faded logbook on the evidence cart. The pages carried the faint scent of jet fuel even after 11 years. Tucked inside the back cover, pressed flat between two sheets of brittle vellum, was the original crayon rocket drawing. Violet trails. A child's unsteady signature in the lower right corner, Clara, age 6. Elias had carried both the key and that drawing the night he kept Meridian alive. The same two objects he carried now. The judge studied the log. The courtroom fell into a hush so complete the ventilation system sounded like distant turbines. Roth's attorney tried to object. The words died when the elderly guard spoke again, unprompted. That's him, the old man said, pointing straight at Elias. That's the ghost mechanic. I watched him climb into the cockpit at 4:06 a.m. and talk that bird down from a cascading avionics failure no one else on base could even diagnose. They gave him a commendation that was later sealed. Then they fired him 3 weeks later when he refused to sign off on falsified maintenance reports. The brass key felt suddenly heavier, as if the metal itself remembered. Day 6. 12:08 a.m. They left the courthouse under a sky the color of gunmetal. Vanessa drove. Elias sat in the passenger seat of the black SUV, the acrylic case balanced on his knees. The city lights slid across the case like runway markers. Roth looked shaken, she said quietly. Not defeated. Shaken. Elias turned the case slowly. Inside, the crayon rocket caught the passing neon and seemed to move. He still thinks I'm just the mechanic. The logs will change that by morning. Vanessa's fingers tightened on the wheel. There's a new motion on the docket. They want the car moved to a private facility tonight. Before the auction. They're calling it protective relocation. Translation, they're going to torch the classified compartments before anyone else can look inside. Elias watched the rain begin again, fine needles against the windshield. The key beneath his shirt had cooled, but only slightly. Day 6. 2:57 a.m. The private hangar at the edge of McCarran smelled of wet concrete and aviation fuel. Security lights painted everything sodium yellow. Elias moved through the shadows the way he once moved through hostile airspace, silent, deliberate. The brass key was now in his hand, warm again, almost vibrating. 2 guards patrolled the far fence line. Their radios crackled with Roth's updated orders. The Meridian sat under tarps in the center of the hangar, a sleeping predator. The sight of her silhouette after 11 years tightened something behind Elias's ribs he had not allowed himself to name. He reached the access panel beneath the left wing. The key slid home with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. The panel side open. Inside, the emergency transponder that had never been listed on any official manifest still waited, its battery at 17% after more than a decade of silent standby. Elias connected a palm-sized diagnostic unit he had kept wrapped in oilcloth since the day they stripped his clearances. The screen flickered to life. Green text scrolled across it. Mission archive recovered. 287 flight hours classified. Pilot designation, Ghost 01. He allowed himself one slow breath. The smell of old hydraulic fluid rose from the open panel like a greeting from an old friend. Then the first new crisis arrived. A third guard stepped around the nosegear, flashlight sweeping low. The beam caught Elias full in the face before he could retreat into shadow. The guard's eyes widened with recognition that had nothing to do with recent news coverage. You, the man whispered. You're the one who pulled my brother out of the wreckage at Groom Lake in '09. They said you didn't exist. Elias froze. The brass key was still slotted into the panel behind him, exposed. The diagnostic unit continued to scroll its quiet green secrets. The guard lowered his flashlight. For 3 heartbeats the only sound was rain on the hangar roof. Then the guard spoke again, voice low. Roth's men are 10 minutes out. They're bringing thermite charges. You need to be gone before they get here. Elias studied the man's face. Early 40s. Stress fracture in the left boot. The same subtle limp he had seen in the mislabeled security photo. The guard reached into his jacket and produced a folded letter, edges worn soft with handling. My brother kept this. Said I'd know the man who wrote it if I ever saw him again. The paper was the exact size and weight as the one Elias had once tucked behind the crayon rocket drawing. Same watermark. Same faint scent of jet fuel. The guard pressed the letter into Elias's hand and stepped back. I never saw you. But if that bird goes up in flames tonight, a lot of good men's names go with it. Day 6. 3:42 a.m. Elias was back in the SUV before the first of Roth's black Suburbans turned into the service road. Vanessa waited in the driver's seat, engine already running. The crayon rocket case rested on the console between them like a talisman. In his lap lay 2 objects now. The brass key, still warm. And the second folded letter, identical to the one he had given a dying pilot 11 years earlier. The diagnostic unit had copied 43% of Meridian's sealed archive before he pulled the plug. Enough to prove the car had never been scrap. Enough to prove Elias had never been just a mechanic. Vanessa glanced at the new letter. Another piece. He nodded. One more before the auction. Then the room gets to see exactly what Roth thought he could bury. She pulled onto the rain-slick highway. The city lights stretched ahead like afterburners once more. Behind them, the hangar lights faded into the downpour. Day 6. 7:19 a.m. Roth stood at the window of his penthouse suite, Brioni jacket unbuttoned for the first time in public. The Patek read 7:22. A fresh pot of coffee cooled untouched on the marble counter. The metallic taste of the previous night's rain still lingered on his tongue. His phone buzzed. The head of hangar security. The thermite team found nothing, sir. The access panel was open but the bird's still intact. And one of our own guards is missing. Roth closed his eyes. The image of Elias sitting motionless in courtroom 17C refused to leave him. The man had not raised his voice once. Had not threatened. Had simply waited, like something patient and enormous that had finally decided to surface. Roth opened his eyes again. The private apology was still far off, but the first crack in his certainty had appeared. He picked up the phone and dialed the auction house. Delayed the opening by 2 hours. Something has come up. Outside, the rain had stopped again. The city smelled clean for the first time in days. Somewhere across town, Elias sat at a plain diner table with the acrylic case in front of him. The crayon rocket caught the morning light and threw violet patterns across cheap formica. He unfolded the new letter. The handwriting was his own, aged 11 years. The final line read simply, "If you're reading this, Ghost 01, the sky still needs you." The brass key lay beside the letter like a promise not yet paid. Day 7. 9:14 a.m. The second hearing convened in a larger courtroom. More cameras. More spectators. The crayon rocket had become an unlikely media darling after a leaked photo from the previous day, violet against courtroom oak. Vanessa carried the case openly now, no longer hiding it. Roth entered wearing the same midnight three-piece, but the knot in his tie was slightly off-center. A small thing. A telling thing. His attorney began with a new motion, voice still oiled but now carrying the faintest tremor. Your Honor, in light of newly surfaced maintenance logs, we request a private inspection of the aircraft before the auction proceeds. Certain technical concerns have arisen. The judge looked from Roth to Elias and back again. Concerns or convenient destruction, counselor? The gallery murmured. Roth's fingers found the edge of the plaintiff's table and held on. Elias said nothing. The key rested against his chest once more, its heat steady, patient. 19 hours had become 11. The grind continued, each day peeling back another layer the way an old tarp is slowly pulled from a wing that was never meant to be forgotten. But the next mini-crisis was already moving toward them in the form of a sealed envelope delivered by courier at 10:07 a.m. The return address belonged to the Department of Defense. Inside were redacted pages that mentioned a pilot called Ghost 01 exactly 17 times. And one unredacted line that made even Vanessa's hand tremble when she read it aloud at the defense table. Pilot identity remains classified. However, all subsequent operations trace back to the individual terminated under false pretenses on December 12, 2013. Recommend immediate restitution before the Meridian asset is offered to the public. Roth overheard the last sentence. His polished Italian shoes shifted once on the marble floor. The Patek caught the light again, but this time the reflection looked almost like surrender beginning to take shape. Elias folded the new letter from the guard into the same pocket that held the crayon rocket's original backing paper. Two objects becoming three. The debt was collecting itself now, one procedural hour at a time. And the room had not yet seen what the key could unlock when the final tarp came off in front of them all. The courtroom clock read 11:42 a.m. when the bailiff handed the courier's envelope to the clerk. Day 14 of the public record. Elias sat motionless in the same navy jacket, collar still frayed at the third button. Vanessa accepted the packet, broke the wax seal with a thumbnail, and began scanning. Her lips parted once, then closed. She read the final paragraph out loud for the record, voice low but steady enough for the gallery to catch every syllable. Pilot identity remains classified. However, all subsequent operations trace back to the individual terminated under false pretenses on December 12, 2013. Recommend immediate restitution before the Meridian asset is offered to the public. A ripple moved through the benches like cold air through an open hangar door. Roth's head turned a fraction. The faint tremor in his attorney's earlier voice returned, stronger now. Elias kept his eyes on the oak grain of the plaintiff's table. The key rested against his sternum, warm from body heat, a small iron heartbeat counting down with him. 11 hours until the auction gavel. Vanessa slipped the documents back into their sleeve. Her fingers brushed the folded crayon rocket backing paper she now carried in the same leather case. The drawing on it had started to fade years ago, but the smell of cheap wax still clung to the fibers. She did not look at Elias. Not yet. Outside on the courthouse steps the November wind smelled of wet concrete and diesel. Roth paused at the top, Italian soles scraping lightly. He watched Elias descend alone, shoulders square under the cheap jacket. For the first time Roth's hand went to his own tie, straightening the knot that had refused to sit right all morning. Day 15 began at 5:17 a.m. with a single knock on the motel room door. Elias opened it to find a man in a plain gray hoodie holding a cardboard box the size of a child's coffin. No markings. The man said nothing, simply handed it over and walked back into the dark parking lot. Inside the box lay a single black flight helmet, cracked along the left visor, the callsign Ghost 01 still stenciled in faded white. A faint trace of old jet fuel rose from the interior padding. Elias closed the lid again and set the box beside the bed. He did not sleep after that. At 8 a.m. he carried the helmet in a plain duffel to the county hangar where the Meridian jet sat under fresh tarps. Vanessa was already waiting, arms crossed against the chill. Two mechanics stood nearby, tools idle. Maintenance logs say this bird hasn't flown since 2013, one of them muttered. Avionics are fried. Whole thing's scrap. Vanessa glanced at Elias. He said nothing. He simply unzipped the duffel, lifted the cracked helmet, and placed it on the workbench. The mechanics fell quiet. The older one reached out, ran a thumb across the faded call sign. Recognition flickered behind his eyes like a switch being thrown. Ghost 01, he whispered. I thought that story was a rumor. Elias pulled the small iron key from beneath his shirt. He walked to the jet's starboard access panel, a panel no one had opened in 11 years. The key slid in without resistance. One smooth turn. A soft click echoed inside the hangar like a round chambering. Lights that had been dark since the Obama administration flickered on, one row at a time. The smell of warmed electronics drifted out. The younger mechanic took an involuntary step back. That's not possible. Vanessa's hand found the crayon rocket paper inside her case again. She rubbed the edge between thumb and forefinger, the same motion she had used the night she first learned Elias had a daughter who drew rockets before the world took her father away. 19 hours until the auction. Roth arrived at the hangar at 10:30 a.m. uninvited, flanked by two aides and his lead counsel. He stopped 6 feet from the open panel. The jet's cockpit displays glowed soft blue. Roth's Patek caught the reflection and threw it across the concrete like a dying star. His attorney cleared his throat. This is highly irregular. We demand these proceedings be moved to a secure DoD facility. The judge, who had followed in a separate car, simply raised an eyebrow. "The aircraft is still under civil lien, Counselor." "Proceed." Roth's polished shoes shifted again. The tremor had moved from his voice into his hands. He watched Elias reroute a single freight wire with the calm of a man who had done it 287 times before. The jet's auxiliary power unit hummed to life, a low steady growl that rattled the loose hangar windows. Mini Crisis Number 3 arrived by encrypted email at 1:14 p.m. Vanessa's phone buzzed on the work table. She read the subject line once, twice. Then she handed the device to Elias without a word. The message was from a retired 3-star general whose name had been redacted but whose signature remained visible. It contained 2 attached files. The first was a flight log showing Ghost 01 had completed a classified extraction over the Hindu Kush on the exact night Elias was supposed to have been court-martialed and quietly erased. The second file was a scanned photo, a little girl no older than 6 holding the same crayon rocket drawing, standing beside a man in a flight suit whose face had been blacked out. The caption beneath read, "She still believes her dad is coming home." Elias stared at the image until the hangar lights blurred. The key burned against his chest like a brand. He folded the printed photo once, then again, and slid it behind the crayon rocket backing paper. 3 objects now. The debt growing heavier with every added layer. Roth, standing 10 feet away pretending to examine a clipboard, saw the motion. His jaw tightened. For the first time the Brioni suit looked one size too large. Day 16. 7 hours remaining. The hangar phone rang at 6:22 a.m. The older mechanic answered, listened, then handed the receiver to Elias. A woman's voice came through, thin with static in ears. "They told me you were dead. They showed me a coffin with your name on it. I kept the rocket you drew with her the night before you left." Elias closed his eyes. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the ghost of cheap motel soap and the faint crayon wax that still clung to the paper in his pocket. "I know," he said. Only 2 words. The line went quiet for 4 full seconds. The woman's next breath shook. "They're trying to sell the plane you used to bring 23 people home that night. Don't let them." The call ended. Elias set the receiver down. When he turned, Vanessa was watching him. Her eyes held a question she no longer needed to ask out loud. Roth entered the hangar at 9 a.m. carrying his own sealed envelope. His Italian shoes clicked with less certainty now. He placed the packet on the workbench beside the cracked helmet. "These are the original termination papers," he said. His voice had lost its courtroom polish. "They list cause of death as training accident. My signature is on the bottom." He did not look at Elias. He looked at the helmet instead, at the faded call sign that seemed to stare back. "I thought I was protecting the program," Roth continued. The Patek on his wrist caught the blue cockpit glow again, but the reflection no longer looked like power. It looked like a clock running backward. Elias said nothing. He simply picked up the iron key once more and walked to the jet's main access hatch. The tarp that had covered the tail for 11 years had been pulled back 3 feet the day before. Today he pulled it another 3. The serial number stenciled beneath caught the morning light, the same tail number that had appeared in every redacted log the DoD had reluctantly released. The gallery of mechanics, attorneys, and one silent federal observer watched in perfect quiet. The only sound was the soft rustle of canvas and the steady idle of the auxiliary power unit. Vanessa stood beside Elias now, the leather case open in her hands. Inside it the crayon rocket paper rested on top of the newly printed photograph and the original letter from the guard. 4 objects. The collection almost complete. Roth's shoulders dropped an inch. He took 1 step closer to the wing, close enough to smell the kerosene and the years. 6 hours until the auction gavel fell in the marble lobby downtown. The next courier arrived at 11:03 a.m. This envelope was thicker. When Vanessa opened it, a single dog tag slid out and clattered onto the workbench. The name stamped on it had been partially filed off, but the blood type and the last 4 numbers of a service ID were still legible. Elias picked it up. His thumb traced the edge exactly the way it had traced the same tag every night for a decade in a desert that officially did not exist. Roth watched the motion. His mouth opened, then closed. The tremor had reached his knees. The grind continued. Day 17. 4 hours left. They moved the jet by flatbed at dawn under police escort. The hangar doors rolled open with a sound like distant thunder. Elias rode in the passenger seat of the lead truck, the iron key now on a plain chain around his neck, resting above the faded crayon rocket paper he had transferred to his own shirt pocket. The metal warmed against skin that had flown 287 combat missions no one was allowed to acknowledge. Behind them, Roth followed in a Blacktown car. His tie was still crooked. No one had the courage to tell him. The county auction hall waited at the end of a rain-slicked boulevard. Inside, rows of numbered chairs had been set up facing a low stage where the jet would be displayed on a raised platform once the tarps came fully off. The smell of fresh coffee and floor polish mixed with the faint metallic bite of hydraulic fluid that had begun to weep from the Meridian's undercarriage during transport. Elias took his seat in the 3rd row. Vanessa sat beside him. She opened the leather case one last time and laid the growing collection of objects on the empty chair between them, the backing paper, the printed photo, the guard's letter, the dog tag. The key stayed against his chest, counting down with every beat. Roth chose a seat directly across the aisle. His polished shoes reflected the overhead fluorescence. The Patek read 9:47 a.m. 3 hours until the bidding began. A new mini-crisis arrived in the form of a single sheet of paper handed to the auctioneer at 10:12 a.m. It was a last-minute injunction filed by an offshore shell company Roth had quietly retained the night before. The document claimed the jet's title had been transferred to a private collector in Geneva before the civil suit was ever filed. The auctioneer read the injunction aloud. The room stirred again, the same low murmur that had followed every fresh leak. Elias did not move. He simply reached into his pocket, produced a second key, and laid it on the collection of objects. This one was smaller, brass, stamped with a DoD crest that had not been seen in public for 11 years. He slid the entire stack across the aisle until it rested against Roth's left Italian shoe. Roth looked down. The brass key caught the light like an accusation. For the first time since the proceedings began, Roth met Elias's eyes directly. The polished mask cracked another fraction. What showed beneath was not fear. It was recognition, slow and terrible, like a man finally remembering the face behind the call sign he had buried. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "We will need a recess to verify this new filing." The room emptied in clusters. Roth remained seated. So did Elias. Vanessa stood, walked to the side exit, and left the 2 men alone with the growing pile of evidence between them. Outside, the rain had started again. Inside, the only sound was the soft ticking of Roth's Patek and the distant rumble of the Meridian's auxiliary power unit still idling on the platform, waiting for the final tarp to come off. The debt had not yet been paid in full. But every hour brought the moment closer. Roth stared at the evidence for a long moment, then reached into his own jacket and produced a final sealed folder. He placed it on the pile without a word. Inside were the original unredacted black budget transfer orders that proved he had personally authorized the falsified termination and the attempt to sell the prototype to erase all traces of the program. "I thought burying it would protect everyone," Roth said, voice barely above a whisper. "I was wrong. The car is yours, Elias. The program is yours. Take it." Elias met his eyes one last time. The brass key had gone cool against his chest for the first time in days. He slid the entire collection, the letters, the photo, the dog tag, the keys, back across the aisle. "Keep them," he said. "Use them to make it right." The Sentinel was never scrap. It was a second chance. For both of us. Vanessa re-entered the hall. The auctioneer returned. The gavel fell not on a sale, but on a quiet settlement, full title transferred to Elias Crowe, complete federal restitution ordered for the falsified record, and Roth's empire placed under immediate oversight pending full disclosure of the buried program. The car's ultimate fate was decided that afternoon. It would be restored under Elias's hand, its safeguard systems finally revealed to the world as the safeguard of something far greater, the truth. Roth's complete downfall came quietly in the months that followed, his empire dismantled piece by the very secrets he had tried to bury. Elias drove the Sentinel out of the hall that evening, Clara's newest rocket car drawing taped to the dash beside the brass key. For the first time in 12 years the engine purred without secrets, without sabotage, without fear. The hidden safeguard systems had done their final job. The mystery was over. The restitution was complete.